Okay, that's enough of me talking. Um, Over to Jack, who's going to talk to us. I have no idea what this presentation is going to be about, but I know it's required some research and it's all about beer in Sardinia. So thank you. Over to you, Jack.
Hey, is that sharing okay?
Yep,
Cool, brilliant. And can you hear me all right? I've got the windows open because it's very hot
yep.
here at the moment in the flat, so I've hear a bit of noise. It might be. Cool. So why Sardinia? I'll start with that. Unfortunately, my wife's from there, so I'm very fortunate. I've been able to visit multiple times over the last 7 years. And I find it quite an interesting place beer-wise because I think generally when we think of Italy, we think of a lot of big macro beer, and maybe the assumption is that finding decent local beer is hard to find. But I found quite the contrary, that it's got quite an interesting beer scene, and this is kind of been formed by it's formed three different points that I'll kind of look at. One's kind of focused on domestic Italian brands and regional brands. The other point is on beer artigianale, which is kind of similar to or interchangeable slightly with craft beer. And then finally, the how like the different places, or the sense of place and space, and the authenticity that they use to refer to beer that is quite different to how we look at it. So I think these are all quite important, interesting points. So I'll break down to those sections. To begin with, I want to preface this with a quote that I've come across a few times. Well, just one moment. When I say sharing screen here, can you see the green box? For that? I've not used Zoom in so long, so I don't know if that's probably a bit better. The Sardinia is quite often referred to as like the largest beer consuming region in Italy. I can't find any evidence to support this. I think I first heard it on like a Stanley Tucci's series. The point from that, but there's no real data to say that they consume more beer there. In the country, you'll find it's one of the lower consuming regions, but it's also one of the regions where the interest in beer is growing the fastest from the data I've observed researching this. Um, so yeah, I just think it's kind of an interesting thing. In case you ever hear this, just kind of take it with a pinch of salt. And moving on, I want to talk about domestic brands of Italy, and it's kind of opens. I mean, whilst I know pale pills isn't everyone's favorite topic, it's kind of an important part of discussing beer in Italy, and particularly Sardinia, to kind of paint the backdrop of where we before we move on to our different sections. So, I see if any if this beer is familiar to anyone. Ignusa, it's Sardinia's like largest beer that you're going to see in across the island. You're probably more familiar with these three, the Moretti, Peroni, and Peroni, and these are all owned by big international conglomerates, as you'd imagine. Heineken owning Moretti, Peroni being Asahi, and Moretti being Carlsberg or Carling. I think it's Carlsberg. Um, and then what you'll also see in Italy is another sort of more regional focus on smaller brands as well. Um, and I think it's quite interesting the difference between these with the likes of Beer Moretti and Peroni. You're going to see generally like quite a sort of an overemphasis on quality and authenticity from a country that doesn't really have a brewing history, and how that's kind of been homogenized into like one kind of clear product that you see everywhere. Versus regionally, when they have these sort of smaller brands that are more focused on reflecting a kind of local pride and certain aspects that we don't necessarily get to see. So, for instance, with Messina, they have a beer that has salt, specifically from Sicily, that they hold on to, and they use a lot of the Baroque themes of Sicily within the look of their beer. And then with Raffo from Puglia, they within their branding, they focus a lot on its connection with ancient Greece, and they use a lot of local grain within their brists and use that as a selling point. Uh, Birknusa is very similar to these local brands in the fact that it's distinctly from Sardinia. That they use they use leverage of its locality at like the core of how its beer is perceived. And I think that's an interesting thing when it's particularly with a country that doesn't have a brewing history, how you use this sense of place as its identity. The brewery's it's got a history that kind of mimics like a lot of breweries at the turn of the century. It's kind of got like a beginning with like a kind of savior character that is hit by the turmoil of war, and then also like a multinational buyout. So in 1912, it was run by two guys who they started off with mixed success, but within their first financial year, they ran into some financial troubles, but were fortunate enough to meet this local entrepreneur called Capra. He was very much focused in the wine trade and both importing and exporting wine from the island, but also owning some vineyards as well. And with the outbreak of phylloxera at the start of the century, he kind of saw that there was going to be some issues with wine production and figured that as a form of diversification, beer would be a good business to get into, believing that the relationship it would have with wine would be synergetic and not antagonistic. So he gets involved and kind of saves the company quite early on. And slowly over the next few decades, he buys more and more of the company till he takes over full ownership. Um, and things are going well until they're hindered by production with the outbreak of World War II. This is to the point where their brewery in Calgary, which is the main city in the south of the island, it is used briefly as a air raid shelter whilst they can't produce beer during the war. But then, like many breweries, when the war ends, they have a boom in production with like an increased demand both locally and also in mainland Italy. So they quickly have to start producing beer. And I'm not sure what style of beer they were producing beforehand. I imagine if it wasn't pale pills by this point, it certainly is with the influx of American soldiers staying in Italy. So that certainly takes hold and has an effect, like you see all over Europe at that point in time. So with growing success in the 60s, they open a new brewery site, which is the current one in a suburb of Calgary called Seminy. And this continued success draws the attention of Heineken, who purchased the brewery in 1986. And they don't really do too much of it. They start by brewing other Heineken products at the site, but they also continue to brew Ignusa, but never have that brand produced elsewhere. So it stays very much a Sardinian brand, and they focus on rebranding it as the sort of soul of Sardinia as a product. And they sit with that for many decades until they get to 2012, where after a centennial of the brewery, they decide to diversify all their range. And they launch a new beer called Ignusa Cruda, which is a unpasteurized, slightly stronger special celebration beer at about 5%. Yeah, it's the sort of first step in this kind of their most recent chapter. And whilst this beer is, I think, it's set up to be like a premium brand, it doesn't really take off. And I've only ever really seen it available in supermarkets. So I don't know if this is seen as a win by them or not, but it's just certainly something where Heineken put some attention into. They then launch a Radler in 2014, which is about 1.3%. It's pretty good in terms of like perfect like the beach, but they sort of focus on it as a sort of what you're going to find in Sardinia a lot is there's not much of a demand for alcohol-free beer, but what you do see a lot of is these sort of smaller 200 ml bottles and bar servings, which are perfect if you're driving or at the beach or in like a up and about. And I feel like this kind of fits that kind of niche where it's not an alcohol-free product, but it's certainly in a more refreshing format, which you could easily like drive with. Uh, and then in 2017, they launched probably their most successful other brand or other beer other than their flagship, which is Ignusa Non Filtrata, which is an unfiltered lager. It's kind of like a Keller Pils in a way. It has that kind of fluffy, sort of a hazy appearance. And this is very successful to the point where it becomes probably their biggest seller, and is available all over the mainland as well, and really draws attention to the brand. So much so that it even spreads to the UK a bit. So if you've seen this around, definitely worth giving it a try. I personally prefer this as my favorite beer of their range. And then with the success, Heineken announced that they want to increase production by 54%. And in 2023, they launched their first sort of darker amber sort of lager, which is Amber Limpida, which is a like 5% kind of just another sort of like I guess more specialist beer to sit with non filtrata. And yeah, and it just kind of continues their range to grow. And I think the future is looking pretty good for them. Like they're certainly expanding more and more into mainland Italy, but they're also you'll see them appear in restaurants like Pizza Pilgrims in the UK, as well as Rudy's. And in Heineken's 2024 annual report, they refer to it as a next generation brand, which kind of implies that maybe this is going to start filling the places where they can't quite get the likes of Beer Moretti into certain places, probably due to like a little bit of like oversaturation and kind of a diluted image that it has. So yeah, so I would expect to only good things and see this appear a lot more in the UK. Um, then the next thing I kind of want to talk about is beer artigianale, which in Italy is kind of become synonymous or interchangeable with craft beer, but you have to be careful with the terminology because it kind of predates the American craft beer revolution. And I think that's important with Italy having a shorter brewing legacy. And with that in mind, it's just kind of the focus has never been slightly different on rather than producing certain sort of flagship styles, having a more diverse range has been a core aspect of the image of Birra Artigianale, and also having a focus on local production. So there's sort of period 0 kilometer, which is a popular thing with Italian food, where eating and drinking as locally as possible. And Birra Artigianale has a lot more of that than what you'd probably see in like the sort of craft beer movement. I'd estimate there's probably around 20 plus beer artigianale places in Sardinia. You'll see here there's quite a higher concentration focused on the north, but that's kind of a local bias because I've spent more time there. The south has more of an industrial sort of presence around the capital city of Cagliari, and also is closer to the sort of more flatter agricultural land. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are more there that I'm just not aware of, or will be more there in the future. I'm going to focus on four of these in a bit more detail. Trula and Marduk in the north, and Rubiu and Nanumoru in the south. Trula is like a brew pub in a city of Nuoro, which I visit quite often. And I find they've got they're very small, but they've got a very sort of interesting approach. What you'll find with these sort of, they're four flagship beers. One's an ESB, which might seem quite odd in the middle of the Mediterranean, but when you consider that the other main brewery in Nuoro is Zemina, they have like a focus on British beers as well. It's not so surprising that this kind of sort of malt forward beer is popular, and they understand what it is. And they also produce a very lovable English style porter as well as an American pale ale and an IPA. So that probably sounds like a core range is quite small. They also do some experimentations, but that's probably the smallest that we're going to see here in terms of range. Marduk, who are on the East Coast, they've got a bigger range of about 6 beers. This includes an alt beer and a black IPA that's particularly good as well. So we're seeing some sort of like quite broad styles. But they also make a beer called Sexy Pompia, which incorporates a local sort of citrus fruit that's mostly used in liqueurs and desserts, but is a very sort of like local product and has got a lot of love there. They're probably one of the bigger ones of these four, and they've got pretty good distribution throughout the north and the east coast. They also sort of run other than having their like brewery and tap room, they also have like a little like bottle shop and tap room in Orsay, which is a like popular tourist town. So they're definitely growing and having more of a sort of put themselves on the map a bit more in like touristy areas as well. Rubio similarly is a similar size. They're based in the south, and they have a core range that is about like 8 beers, permanent fixtures. Because of this quite large range, this means that a lot of their beers are also quite malt forward. So they're about 50% I would consider are like amber plus, or amber to dark beers, which I find quite refreshing, particularly in a place where with hot weather. But this is partly to the fact they're like paired with food quite often. They have a big focus on that, and they also run like 2 pizzerias that are sort of like pub tap room venues as well. So they've got some cool spaces there. And then Nanimoru is a smaller birrificio in the south. And I think they're probably one of the more interesting. They have like a very small range of about 4 beers that are permanent. This includes like a Russian Imperial Stout and a Weissenbock, as well as a Pale Ale and a West Coast IPA. Kind of going back to what I was saying about styles, where they're a little bit more sort of variety focus. I find IPA is quite a weird one where like the UK and America, it's seen as kind of the flagship sort of craft beer sort of style. Whilst they're quite popular in Italy, like there's no one style that everyone hangs their hat on as being like their sort of go-to. But I found that Nanimoro make a very good West Coast IPA. They're quite high quality. So I find that if you're ever there and you ever get a chance, it's definitely worth seeking out. They are one, as I was saying, they're one of the smaller ones, and they don't seem to own any sort of venues, unlike the rest here. So you're kind of relying on the sort of like pizzerias across the islands where you may come across restaurants where you will see them, maybe come across them. The other thing that all of these sort of breweries have is they will also show up at like local events, so whether that's beer festivals, and have like some presence there as well. Um, I think beer artisanal is an interesting sort of concept and has like some key differences to craft beer. So I think it's been quite a fun thing to look into. I do have a note on someone to say. Yeah, there's no real sort of unifying styles or like any sort of like beer that I would say is like aspect that's like deeply Sardinian, which I think is probably quite strange, but I think it's mainly because there's been a sort of focus on producing a wide variety in a market that's relatively new. I find that's quite a interesting thing, the fact that you get like a lot of dark beers because of that, which is quite cool. Um, yeah. And then finally, I kind of want to talk about place, space, and authenticity, because it's a very sort of changing environment. So it's got to look at. What you'll find with all beers, or like the majority of beers that I've seen in Sardinia, is they always incorporate some aspect of the place that they're from, whether that's within the design or the naming of their beers. There's always something that kind of reflects Sardinia as a place. For instance, Rubiu, they use flamingo, which is they have a lot of nesting grounds in Sardinia when they migrate. So this is an important part of like the imagery that they have. Marduk incorporates the Bronze Age Neuragic civilization, their sort of imagery. Nanomoru, there was good design references a sort of folklore aspect of a sort of mischievous spirit, which I think is quite cool in their sort of cheeky nature. And then even Ignusa is named after the ancient Greek name for the island. So again, harkening back to kind of a legacy that kind of predates beer being part of their culture. But I think in doing so, they're kind of referencing the people, and that's kind of their aspect of authenticity, the people making the beer rather than the beer itself. And I think that's quite a nice way to kind of create more of an attitude than a specific product as an element of your authenticity. The next sort of important part of this is the places in which you consume beer in Sardinia. Uh, Beer artigianali normally, like you'll find that their venues are more they're as much a restaurant and a bar than anything else. So like you're always going to see that the proximity of the food being a lot closer. This inevitably does bring more of like an overlap with wine. But to kind of harken back to what Capra said when he was getting invested in with Nusa, the relationship isn't antagonistic. They seem to be like on one day where they might be regularly a wine drinker, they're just as likely to experiment with beer if the mood strikes them and how it pairs with the food. So that kind of offering is the kind of a core of these places where you're going to find like a local sort of spirits and wine market, even within a beer artisanale location. I think particularly with food as well, like the pairing of like cold cuts and cheese, like you see here in Zemina on the left, within something that looks probably more like a restaurant bar than what you think an industrial estate in South London, or with Trula's brew pub here. Again, way more homely than what we might expect from a craft beer menu. Their menu as well at Trula is incredible with a lot of grilled meats and a lot of sort of like rustic traditional cooking. So, for instance, they do a lot of like mutton, horse, and other sort of things that we wouldn't normally get to try outside of these sort of rustic menus. Another place that's kind of overlooked, I think, when people are on holiday is the beach. And normally that's because when you're always having a beer at the beach, you're normally prioritizing the location over the actual beer that you're getting to drink. And I'm starting to see a bit of a change towards that. Like a lot of beach bars now having more of a beer artisanale range. And this kind of goes to show that not only is like a local interest is growing, but also tourists are taking note of what's being available, or they're seeking out things that are local when they're there, which I think is quite cool and something which is only going to continue to develop. Yeah. And then finally, I kind of want to talk about authenticity. It's in thinking like the age of Madri, where we've got a beer that's entirely its legacy is kind of like fabricated to kind of fit in the market in the place of the likes of beer Moretti. I know that that was a deliberate tact that Carling put in place, where rather than build a brand, buy a brand with some form of authenticity and develop that image, they've just gone straight to creating the thing in the UK and just getting ahead. And I think that's quite a sad thing. But there's also an aspect of how authentic is the likes of Beer Moretti when, by and large, in the UK, despite its branding, it's produced here, and the actual production of beer itself isn't inherently authentically Italian. So why does it particularly matter? Uh, could Heineken simply move Ignusa to production elsewhere, to like the UK, and would it still be authentic? And my answer would be no. And we know this because they tried it with Messina, their other Italian local brand, and it was hit by a range of boycotts. And they when they closed the plant down, the people who had the original family that started the brewery bought it back and tried to run it to keep employment within Sicily. But when they eventually ran out of money to do that, the brewers themselves formed a co-op to produce their own beer that was local to the town. And that drew the attention of Heineken, who inevitably just bought that as well and joined forces with them and continued to produce and bought back the plant and started producing beer again in Messina. And I feel like that would be a similar story with Ignusa. Like if that was lost as a local business or a local employer, then you'd only see one of the Vera Artigianale try and fill that gap, and maybe even a multinational as well come in to try and fill that space because there's clearly a demand in a market that's growing there. This is kind of evident in the fact that like none of the other breweries have ever tried to champion a unfiltered lager to kind of rival Ignusa Non Filtrata, but they're all aware that that's a sort of space where at some point in time they could fill if needed. So yeah, it's certainly a part of the world that has my first expectations of what beer would be like there is certainly different, and it just goes to show that the market's ever evolving. Yeah, sorry, it's a bit of a short one, but that is my the bulk of it. And I kind of in conclusion have these sort of 3 points that beer may not be dominant in volume, but it certainly has a strong identity in Sardinia that the locals relate to. Secondly, that both Ignusa and Birra Artigianale are entwined with the locality, and they use this as their form of authenticity, where they are deeply from this place, and so is the beer by proxy by being made from people from there. And then, sort of lastly, that like this form of authenticity it will define any success they have there. This is gone, but the desire to drink is inherently tied with drinking from the place itself. Yeah, and that's everything.
Great. Thank you, Jack.
Brilliant. That's really interesting, Jack. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
Haven't got any. I've got open the floor to that.
I was just saying they do that unfiltered Anuccia. Is it Anuccia? Is that how you pronounce it? In my local Italian, which is my pre-cocktail drink.
It's definitely. Yeah, I really like it as a beer, particularly in holiday. I mean, I was aware of it before I went because my wife, who wasn't much of a beer drinker before she met me, would rave about it, saying it's her favorite beer. And I get why. It's definitely brewed to a higher quality than I'd say other sort of Heineken or like Italian level lagers. But yeah, it's good, and I kind of wanted to get ahead of it becoming more and more available in the UK because I can only see that happening sooner and sooner, especially with more sort of like delicatessens and restaurants stocking it. So yeah, definitely worth a try.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's huge on the mainland in Italy. Absolutely
Yeah,
everywhere. Like a massive supermarket beer. Yeah, second only to the big. You really do see it everywhere. It's very eye-catching, their branding as well. Really stands
yeah.
out.
I forgot to mention that the label itself is incorporates the Sardinian flag, so
Mm.
it's probably one of the more sort of famous products from the or mass-produced products that you're going to see from the island. So I think that's it's quite a cool thing that they're very proud of. So yeah, no, I'm a big fan. And then on like the local side as well, the fact that this it's definitely created a wave of like an appetite for good beer there. And I'm certainly impressed by this offering. But it's hard to find good beer sometimes when you're on holiday, but I've not really struggled in Sardinia.
So do you think it's a lot of it seems to be a large amount of craft breweries for possibly the population of the island? Do you think it's driven a lot by tourism?
I if you look at where the breweries are, like there is some overlap with destinations like beach bar, but no, I think it's more there's there an appetite for beer, but I think that's partly to do more so with the people who live there rather than the tourists. And I think that's kind of more related to how beer and food are kind of like come together because it may be particularly with like darker beers, and like we're talking about beer out now, it fits a lot better than winter with the sort of wheat and rich dishes with everything there. It's another sort of interesting. You probably assume it being an island, they're going to eat a lot of seafood, but that's definitely more of a coastal thing. Internally, the island's very sort of mountainous, and like obviously they have a lot of sheep so lamb is very high on like delicacy, particularly when it's like pork. So I think that being a kind of it can be done side pairing with that. Yeah, I think maybe also to do with the weather as well in the summer, so it's more refreshing than wine.
Sorry, Andy, I think we're getting a bit of background noise on your side. Ah, much better. Thank you.
So I've got half of that.
Yeah, I think it could be to do with so it was the kind of the sort of the lamb and pork market there in terms of like that being a big part of the sort of cuisine is something which beer kind of compare very well with that in the summer, and that's certainly
Yeah.
something which kind of fits. Obviously, it being Italy, there is a huge wine market there as well, and they produce like yeah, I'd be remiss not to not mention that. But they, I think the wine range was far more diverse 100 years ago, but they were hit obviously with this blight of a great blight at the turn of the century that's kind of dialed back on that. And I think again they produce obviously a lot of wine and they export it to the mainland Italy, but most of it is consumed on the island. So this they have a very sort of fierce pride of their products, and I think the beer is just another one of those that they champion, and they're very proud of these sort of like smaller breweries. So I think that sort of local support has really sort of helped any sort of small brewery that's come up stay in place. So whilst the availability every time I've gone, like, it might be hard to find one brewery 1 year. They never sort of fully disappear. It's just kind of like maybe they're brewing less 1 year, but then you come back next year and then there'll be more of this one beer that you were looking for. So it's quite nice to see that nothing disappears for good.
I think a lab trip, maybe an
Yeah,
autumnal lab trip.
I would be very happy. So, beautiful place.
I thought your your comments about some of the beer styles are really interesting because whenever I go through to Italy, I remember being really struck by this like you say, quite a curious range of styles on the bar. Yeah, lots of English ones which you would never find this side of the border in France. Porters, lots more dark beers, and all done really quite subtly. They're not, they don't go for these massive Americanized, punchy, off the wall flavors, which actually the French are more likely to do.
Yeah.
It's everything's quite subtle, and the quality of brewing always surprises me. And you can quite often find a hand pump in the craft bars, which is always
I think yeah, in Trula, last time I was there, they had their porter on hand pump. Now I'm not sure if it is cask conditioned or if it was just going through a hand pump from a like pressurized keg or something, but it was lovely. And it's a very small place, and for them to have like a hand pump in general kind of surprise, very pleasant. But yeah, I think this sort of like, and it may be something to do with the fact that with Italy being a kind of beer still feeling relatively new, that there's this kind of need for brewers to sort of showcase range rather than specializing in specific styles, which I think is a very cool thing to have. This kind of sort of reminiscent when we were recently there, we went to a beer festival, and you wouldn't see a single brewery there that had less than 5 beers available. As for opposed, you go to a beer festival in the UK, they made two very a brewery. If they're very happy with 2 beers, they'll have two there. There's nothing like that in terms of going small. They'd rather go wide, which I
Yeah.
think is very cool. The other sort of thing I think is quite weird. I say weird. You probably wouldn't expect with Sardinia is they obviously have like a lot of unique local sort of produce, fruits and vegetables that are quite unique to the island. You'd think they'd incorporate these, but I think the brewers are still very much showcasing styles and the range that they can do. So that's not really been too much thing, with the exception of Marduk, who make a beer called Sexy Pompier that uses this local citrus fruit. You're not really going to see much of like juniper or some of the sort of like the botanicals that are being used, being thrown into these beers, which is cool. But I can see that that may change because there's also a growing amount of craft distilleries who are using these ingredients. So it's not the interest isn't there yet. I just think that it's going to take a bit of time, and before you know it, you're probably going to get like some kind of like local berry used in like a wit beer or something like that. I'm sure, but we're not far away from that once these styles are established. But yeah, I think it's another one that's quite popular. If I was considered one trend is with a lot of the beer artigianale, they wit beer is quite common, or blanche as they call it. But it's one where they all seem to be quite consistently mimicking your quite commercial sort of like when you think of like not necessarily Hogan, but like it was beer Moretti have like a wit beer, and it's kind of they're very sort of on that sort of commercial level of trying to achieve that as an option of just a lighter beer. But but yeah, still quite broad though with that sort of scale.
So I don't know much of Sardinia. I've only been there once. But what they told me, it's what they call, I think they call it a blue region, which means the life expectancy there is like crazy high.
Yeah,
Um, and they're not quite sure why. Something in the meat, or maybe it's the beer. I don't know.
I'd love if it was a beer. I've always sort of thought of it being like if it being a blue zone, that
Yeah.
the double sort of angle of people wanting to live longer because you can live longer there in terms of like whilst people are like generally seen as one of the poorer regions in Italy and people do work a lot longer in their life, they are generally happier with or have more of a motivation to live. So that's probably kind of part of it. Is what I've always thought. But the diet, I think the sort of the food, the social aspect of it are definitely all elements that kind of together. But I think beer is relatively new. As well as another thing I was when I was looking into this, where if you think of people's like grandparents there now, they probably didn't drink beer growing up, or they didn't drink beer necessarily before the war so much, and that this has been a great thing that most people there would have drunk wine or still do drink wine. So this is still like a new thing that's kind of coming into effect. Which is another thing that kind of strikes me when you were in like a bar and like it could be like a very sort of rural village, and you see the sort of like local like tough guy who sat down. You think like a British would expect you to assume this guy's going to have a beer, but he sat down with a dainty red wine glass, and that's because that's what he grew up drinking. It would be like the a very rustic, very strong red wine, and I find that that's their idea of a strong masculine drink, which I think is quite an interesting change of perspective for us. But yeah, and beer is seen as more of a young, growing thing.
How often are you out there, Jack?
This year I've been once. I'm going again in July, and then again in September. So yeah, a few times this year, but usually it's once or twice. So we'll go for summer and hopefully Christmas. But yeah, we went only once last year before I got married out there. So
Mm.
this year we're trying to compensate and go a few more times, and visit the family there. So yeah.
I can imagine they're pretty low key on the weddings.
Oh, that was it was pretty big by my understanding of it. But yeah, they thought by our definition, by the UK, it was huge, but to them they consider, and I thought that was quite a nice sort of middle ground. But yeah, lots of wine and beer there. I think that
Mm.
was a lot of music was flowing.
Um, Unfortunately, I have to go because my wife's come back today. So I just want to say thank you, but please carry on and without me. And thank you, Jack, for a
Yeah.
nice
No, no
presentation.
worries.
Really interesting. Yeah, thanks, Jack.
Right. I did want to keep it relatively short. I mean, I've got a lot to talk on this topic, but it's one of those ones where it can go off in quite a few sort of different directions, and I kind of want to stay focused on like an overview of it. But I'd love to come back to it, and this will be part. This is kind of like spitballing what I'd like to write is like a larger piece on it, because it's something that I find more and more interesting every time I go. So yeah, and I think it's also Italian brewing. I don't think is hugely different or unique because of that. It's just I've had a more focused sort of view.
It'd be good, interesting. Maybe we could do a tasting evening. We
Mm.
could, if I don't know how many are available over here.
I find that with the sort of beer artigianale, I think it's really hard to find those beers even in like mainland Italy. But Ignusa on the opposite end is quite available in the UK. So I think that would be a good one to try, particularly like the non-filtrata. Having that as a kind of, whilst it feels a bit sort of weird to kind of do a tasting of like a macro beer, but to kind of show maybe that'd be a thing to do, like try regional macro beers. They kind of try to see the broad difference that they can be, because
Yeah.
whilst they are generally like particularly when I was talking about like Peroni and Moretti, they are largely feel like the same beer a lot of the time. I think that on like a local level they can have like little nuances that kind of reflect the place that they're from, and I think Ignus is one of those.
Yeah, and even Peroni's got the is it the Grand Reserva Doppelbock or and then there's the oh no, I can never remember the name, but the Italian Pilsner, the famous Italian Pilsner beginning with T,
Tipo Pils.
Tiki Pills as well. Yeah, there's probably a decent selection that are worth. Yeah,
I think I find Tipo feels like a funny one to because I did want to kind of put that in there, but I've every time I've been to a craft brewery in Italy, I've never seen a Italian Pilsner, and I kind of feel like it's a mythical thing. Like I know it exists, but I feel
yeah,
like it's from a very particular region. I've just I guess in the north, I've not spent too much time. And every time I go, it's like, oh yeah, do you want a best bitter or do you want a mild or something like that? And
yeah,
I'm like, no, I've had this like dry hop Pilsner that just doesn't seem to it just doesn't seem to be
yeah,
around.
yeah. The whole English thing, overrepresentation, is a real oddity. I don't think I've been anywhere in the world where English styles are quite
Yeah.
so well represented. Bizarre.
And, and I find it quite funny. Where like it's saying like sometimes you'll get something on like they'll have like a hand pump, but it's quite interesting to taste some styles that we would never put on draft. So like a mild or something like that through CO2 and just a regular sort of line and taste that. And it's especially when they're usually also served quite cold. So yeah, I think that's a very like an ice cold mild is quite an interesting interesting thing. It's yeah.
Perfect.
Not always the best or historically accurate representation of a beer, but still authentic in its own right.
Brilliant.
All right, I'm going to shoot off, but thanks a lot, Jack. That was really, certainly the pictures of the food made me think, oh, I need to go there.
Yeah, I could talk about food movie.
It looks great. All right,
Yeah.
thanks a lot. I'll see everybody
Brilliant.
later. Cheers. Bye.
I need to fly too. Thanks ever so much, Jack. That was great. Take care. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Just stragglers remain. Yeah, I was just thinking everyone just slid out.
Has
So how
anyone
long
got
have you
any?
been? Sorry, how long have you been going over there?
So about 7 years. So soon it'll be 8 later this year, I think. But yeah, so a fair bit, and it's been a place where I think the first time I went there, I'm just saying that I wasn't aware of many of the sort of local breweries there. But it's one of these sort of things like when you're in that sort of headspace, you slowly sort of find like without having to like look too hard, finding beers to drink was I found it quite natural and quite easy. So without really having to do too much research, I'd already had like a list of 10 plus breweries I'd actually drunk from. And then last time I was there in April, I kind of ticked off a few more. So it's definitely like a growing thing. But yeah, no, I get them quite often. And it's I'm very lucky in the fact that they live out there. So spoiled in a way.
Do you say your wife's Sardinian?
Yeah. So she's from Nuoro, which is the city in it's kind of the north center.
Nice. Yeah, it felt familiar, like me going to Czech Republic kind of thing, and sort of slowly discovering stuff out there that you can
It
go to a new
sounds
country and your first thing is like, right, what's the beer scene like here?
Especially when it's like I found it like even we took a flyby visit for a wedding to Bulgaria last year, and even then it was like trying as many sort of again mostly focused on like macro beer, but just like trying as many different sort of broad beers that you can have there just to get a bit of a taste of what it's like. I think that's quite nice to kind of throw into a holiday. Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't always have to be the most sort of like high quality stuff, but just trying to get a picture.
Yeah, yeah. And what people there drink is always nice. I
Yeah.
feel like it helps you understand people better.
Yeah, it sounds interesting that it's an evolving beer scene. So it's quite interesting to see a country where, as you say, if they haven't really been drinking beer for that long in comparison to, say, this country,
Yeah.
they're trying out different things and haven't actually got their feet yet. And it'd be interesting to
Yeah.
see if they do get into that, especially with the idea of locally produced, local, and using local products and so on, local fruit or whatever, whether that becomes their thing.
Yeah, like I was trying to think if there was anything inherently Sardinian in like the beers there. And the only thing really I could kind of identify was maybe a preference for like malt forward beers, and I think this is probably in juxtaposition to like how like available like pale lager is, where no one's really out there making pilsners and no one's out there making like Keller Pils or anything that kind of gets close to like the mass produced beer. They are like, no, let's make an alt beer, or let's do a Weissenbock, or let's make a Russian Imperial Stout. Like quite broad like styles that are very hard to find even in the UK, let alone in what's called in Italy. So I think that's great. I think also the darker beer because it like contrasts with pale beer. That's obviously one thing, but also how it pairs maybe with the food a bit more is like another nice little touch where it's probably closer to how they feel about red wine if you're having that with food as opposed to having beer like lager just to drink on its own.
Can they grow grain out there at all, or do they import it all?
I suspect that they're imported by and large they're importing the bulk of their grain. But however, there is like a small sort of like there's an area in the south which is more flat, and that's where they have a history of growing grain for. Because they've got a long history of making bread, but through their sort of like they've been producing wine on the island for as long as people have been living there. They're like one of the sort of oldest wine producing areas in the Mediterranean along with like Greece, like they very quickly got into that. So I don't think they've ever really been producing beer to drink throughout history, but they could have done is the truth. I just think that wine was more accessible, so that was just sort of what they sort of stuck with. But a growing thing that I see in Italy is like even on like a macro level, breweries kind of using local grains or like trying to grow barley in their region so they can use it almost as like a marketing gimmick to be like, oh, this I think Peroni do it with Nastra Azzurra, the or what we call Peroni in the UK. And they all say like the region name, it'll be like the Pugliese version of that, and they will use a percentage of grain that's grown locally. Raffo do it with their beers as well, where they try and use that. But I think by and large, it's still being imported or it's from other regions. But I think it would be cool to. I think the issue is probably more like they need a monster. If they had that, then they could probably do some very cool stuff on like a very small scale. But I think that might be the final evolution where there's like a brewery opens that's also like a monster and is 100% their own kind of thing, and that'd
Right.
be like, a very very
Yeah.
big win. Has anyone got any travel plans coming up soon?
Well, we've never been there. It does look interesting. I mean, I've been looking at a map on the screen as well at the same
Yeah,
time.
we've got one on the right with the terrain map, so it shows where all the mountainous bits are and so on.
I'd strongly recommend it if you like the outdoors in particular. And also I think it's a place that I find particularly beautiful even in like winter, which is probably very very off season. But a lot of the towns I think it's more to do with like a lot of places obviously like still have like fireplaces and the smell when you go through like a small town there is of a burning pine is very lovely in winter. So
Jack, how's the cycling there? Are there any routes, single track, or like
I'm
mountains, anything?
there is lots of cycling there. I'm not particularly a cycling person, but I'm aware that a lot of people go on holiday to specifically like cycle there, as well as rock climbing. Those are like two quite big sort of outdoorsy sort of sports. I also it's not particularly good for surfing because of how the beach is formed, but there is a lot, and also it being in the Med. But there's in the north, there's a lot of like windsurfing as well. So if you're into kind of outdoorsy things, it's definitely a lot to do. But yeah, if you're a cyclist, you'd love it.
Did they? I think did they start the Tour de France there a few years back, or was that?
That might be Corsica. If
Oh yeah, no, I might be thinking of Corsica. Yeah.
I think there is a particular bike race somewhere on the island that is quite famous though. But I would have to double check.